Hello everyone and welcome back to this fourth session of the fifth week of the Angular development course. Now we have understood so far on what is services, what is the concept of a synchronous data stream, why we require reactive programming and what is RxJS. But before going any further, let's just dive in a bit and understand the difference between an observable and promises. So if you just recollect from our previous session, I said that RxJS uses something called observable to handle a synchronous data stream. But in your traditional JavaScript, you already have a concept called as promises, which also handles your asynchronous data stream. So now we try to understand the difference between both of them. So both observables and promises are the utilities which helps us to work with asynchronous functionality in JavaScript, as we discussed earlier. So observables are superior to promises in a few aspects when compared to promises. So that's why we see that in Angular and in RxJS we are using observables on a very heavy. So observables are superior to promises in a few aspects. So that is why we see that they are used on a higher perspective, or we'd say they are being most popularly in Angular and RxJS compared to promises. So what are these advantages which observables has over the promise? We'll see it in the next slide. So this is a quick simple table which we have created just to outline what are the differences between promises and observables. So let's go by them one by one. So first is that observables have multiple values which are emitted over a period of time, but a promise can only have a single value emitted at a time. Meaning, say assume I'm going to subscribe to a observable. Okay, so it does not mean that that observable will only give me one value and after that it stops. The observable can give me a steady stream of data, as I said, for example, a user mouse cursor tracking function, right? So that if I subscribe to that as observable, so what happens is I can get the steady stream of mouse data over the period of time. Whereas with the promises, the problem is that I can only get the data one value at a time, and after that promises stops. So for those kind of scenarios, if you see, promises is actually not a good scenario to be used. Second is observables are lazy and not executed until we subscribe to them using subscribe method, whereas promises are eager and execute immediately after their creation. What is the meaning is, if you have worked on JavaScript and you have seen promises, so the moment you kind of create a promise, it is executed. So any function or any statement that you write inside that promise gets executed immediately once you declare it. Okay. But observables are not like that. You can create an observable and unless you subscribe to them, those do not get executed. So that is one advantage of it. Okay. The next is the observables have subscription that are cancelable using unsubscribe method, which stops the listener from receiving further values. But promises, you don't have this concept of canceling it. Okay. So I will tell you the example of it. So say I have subscribed to observable which is kind of returning me a steady stream of data. But now as my application is is getting executed, and now I have reached a point where I feel that okay, at this I no more don't require this stream of data that is coming in. So using observable I can just unsubscribe it. Okay. But in promise, so say assume I have a chain of promise and they are getting executed, and maybe one of the promises taking some time. I don't have any means to cancel my promise if it is I want to cancel any in between promises. Okay, that is one of the other advantage which observable has. Similarly, observables, as I said, if you remember the tab example that I said, you can have operators which can transform your data or aggregate your data, perform some operations on your data. So your RxJS gives you some operators like map, retry, fork join, there are bunch of operators which is available. So using those operators, you can kind of transform your data and perform additional enhancements or utilities. You can write utilities on top of your observables. But on promises, we don't have any such additional operators, and any functionality which you want to add, you have to manually write your own custom code. Okay. And similarly, in observables, the error from the observable is directly sent to the subscriber, whereas in the promises, it pushes the error to the child promises. So what it means is, so if I have say subscribed to an observable and that observable has failed for some reason, so assume I have made an API call and that API call has failed. So whoever is the direct subscriber will get the error directly into them. Okay. But in case of promise, what happens is directly the subscriber won't get the error, but rather whatever is the child promises of that particular promise, that will get the error. Okay. It kind of pushes down the hierarchy. So that is another advantage we have with observables. So next, now that we have understood a bit about what is observables and promises, in the next few slides, we will be covering the concept of how to create, subscribe to an observable and how to apply various RxJS operators on these observables. So now that we understand what is RxJS library, so now that we have understood what is observable, we'll now understand what is RxJS library. So RxJS library is nothing but reactive extension of JavaScript. That is the full form of RxJS. So it is a library that is used for reactive programming using observables that makes it easier for us to suppose any asynchronous or callback based code. Okay. So RxJS provides an implementation of observable type which is needed until the type becomes part of JavaScript and until browsers support it. So what this mean by that is, by default your JavaScript does not support observables. Okay, so there is no data type called observables which is part of your default JavaScript implementation. Okay, JavaScript understands promise but it does not understand observable. So till the point your observable is available as a default JavaScript utility, like wherein you can directly execute observable in your browser. So what RxJS does is, in the background, as if you remember the concept we talked earlier, since your TypeScript cannot be understood by your browser directly, it gets transpiled into JavaScript. So similarly, what RxJS does is, behind the scenes, it will convert all this observable code into the equivalent JavaScript code till the point, once your browser or JavaScript enables the observable data type or the data stream, then at that point of time, then the RxJS won't require to implement that as part of its library. So that's what the second point means. Okay. And also, as we discussed earlier, RxJS provides us utilities called operators, which helps us to perform additional operations on observables, such as converting existing code for async operations into observables, iterating through values in a stream, mapping values to different types, filtering streams, composing multiple streams, so on and so forth. So what it means is, so say assume I make a call, I subscribe to observable, and now again I want to once I receive the data from that particular observable, I would now want to make another call, I want to change my observable. So that is possible using operator. Similarly, I get a data from my observable, but now I want to convert the data, so that is also possible. If I want to filter my data that I get, I just want to either take or reject one value, even that is possible using operators. Similarly, if I want to make, say, 5 separate or parallel API calls or a parallel observable subscription and combine the data into one, even that is possible. So all these kind of different scenarios we can achieve using RxJS operators. So now we have seen enough of the theory, so let's dive into RxJS and understand it more in detail, right, in terms of the code. Okay. And before we get into code, I want you guys to visit this site, which is rxjs.dev. So this is the official RxJS website, and I want you guys to as part of this week self-study, I want you guys to go through this website and understand RxJS better. So if you open the website, first there will be kind of this introduction, and here you will have something called Get Started. So where you will get a basic introduction of what is RxJS, what are the various things, why you require RxJS and all that thing. Okay. So since this course is purely focusing on Angular, we will not be getting deep into RxJS because RxJS itself is a very big course. But what I will do is, as part of this course, I will teach you guys the key part or the key concepts that you guys need to know as part of RxJS, so that as we develop any applications down the line, you can use RxJS out of the box. And also, in future, if you require any any assistance, or you want to find out if you can do certain thing, there is a utility which can help you to do that. Okay. So first, if you come on the overview on this website, you will see on the left hand side there are these few things. One is called observable, observer, operator, subscription, subjects, scheduler, marble testing, so on and so forth, right? So before we get any further, I want you guys to just focus on few of these terms. Okay. And another advantage of this site is there is something called a glossary link over here. So if you click on that, it will just give you the bunch of various glossary or the keywords which we use in the observables. Okay, so I'll just run you guys through some of the major things that we use. So one is called the consumer. So consumer is nothing but, say, if I have a component. So say in our case I have app component. Okay, so and I'm subscribing to a observable which is there in test service. So my app component in this case is nothing but my consumer. Okay, and what is a producer is any you can say any variable or any function that is kind of producing those data stream is nothing but your producer. So in our case, if my this observable is defined as part of test service and I give it a name of, say, get user data, so this get user data is nothing but the producer. Okay, next is the subscription. So what is subscription is, subscription means that where your consumer is kind of observing or listening to a producer. So a simple example for that would be if you take your cable TV subscription, right? So what happens is you switch on your TV. So you are the consumer and your cable TV guy is the producer. So you switch on the TV, and as and when there is a new channel or a new program coming in, you get to see it on your TV, right? So similar to that, what happens is there is a contract, or like there is a kind of a deal which is made between a consumer and producer, wherein the producer says that, hey, this is the data I'm going to give, and the consumer would be like kind of observing to it or listening to it. Okay, so that process is called as subscription. The next is called as observable, which we saw earlier. So observable is nothing but it's just a data type in RxJS which is used to kind of play around with asynchronous data streams. So as I again said earlier that observable is not a default data type in JavaScript. So anything that you write in RxJS again gets recompiled into plain JavaScript code using the basic JavaScript data types. Okay. The next is called as a observer. So observer is nothing but observer, in a simple word, if you say like what is observer, observer is nothing but it's also a kind of a consumer. So what a observer does is it can listen to all the data events or the event update that happens in a subscriber. Okay, and I think that is enough for now. The other things that is required as part of this glossary we will be seeing in our code. And anyways, for your self study, I would recommend that you just go through this and like get your head around all these concepts. Okay, so it's not that tough. So you just give it a cursory glance, you'll be able to understand it. Okay. So with that being said, I will work you guys through a few of the basic observables and basic things that we do with RxJS. And before we proceed, I also want you to tell you guys one thing that for now in this week session, we are just going to play around with static data in our local. In the next week session, we will actually be making API calls and we will be subscribing to third-party API data. So in there, we will be seeing RxJS even more in detail. Okay. So for now, just hang on with me and just try to understand the concept of RxJS. And as we proceed with our session and course, we'll be looking into even more in-depth concepts as well. So coming back to code, right? So what I will do is I will come to our app component.ts. Okay. And or better, what we can do is we can first go to the test service.ts. Okay. So what I will do over here is we saw a few concepts like we saw something like subject, we saw something like observables and so on and so forth. So now we'll try to kind of implement those. Okay. So first let's try to like implement a asynchronous data stream using observable. Okay. So if I'll give you a simple example. So like assume that I want you to mock a API response. When I say mock a API response, I mean to say, as I said to you, API is nothing but a asynchronous data, right? You make a call to a server, maybe after even 1 millisecond you will get the data, and you then return that data back to whoever has subscribed to it, right? So I want you to mock this similar functionality now using a observable. How can we do that? Okay, so I'll just type it here for your understanding. Okay, so just to ensure that you're clear, so what I'm going to do now is we are going to mock an API operation. And what is an API is nothing but, so say on your UI, like on your front-end application or your Angular application, you want to fetch some data from your server, okay? Which is like, say maybe I want to get a list of usernames, or I want to get maybe what is the price of gold right now, or whatever it could be. So I want to mock it without actually making that API call. How can I do that using a observable is what we are going to see now, okay? So assume that whatever function or that whatever function I create, let's give it a name of say maybe mock API data. Okay. And to this, what I can do is now using RxJS operators, I can now assign it some observable. Okay. So what I can do is there are predominantly like two ways in which you can assign it some data. Okay. So one is like you can use an off operator, OF off. So if you just type off, it will give you the thing. So just press enter, it will import this off directly for you. So when you use off operator, what RxJS does for you is anything you pass as argument of this off operator, it will return that as a data back to you. Okay. So in our case, just assume that I want I assume that like my API is going to return me a data. So say assume like it's going to return me name RxJS and course, it say returns me Angular. Okay. So assume that even in real world, if I make an API call, it's going to return me this. Okay. So now I don't have API, so I can still mock that functionality using this off variable. So what off does is, off is nothing but it will just return me an observable, and anything I pass inside this will be the response of that observable stream. Okay. So this is the now what we have done is we have just kind of created a mock observer over here. Okay. So how can I subscribe to this observable and get data? Let's see that. Okay. So what I will do is I'll go into my lazy2 component.ts, or it's not just required. You can go to lazy2. You can go to any component which can, like, inject this test service. So for sake of simplicity, I'm going into lazy2 component. What I'll do over here is I'll just create a button. Okay, so what I've done is basically I've just created a button which on clicking it will invoke this subscribe mock API function. And what I'll do now is I'll just create this subscribe mock API button function. And here what I'll do is I have to now subscribe to that observable which I have created. So how to do that is, first I will just invoke this copy of test. Inside that I have this mock API data. And when I hit on dot, it will show me a few things. So here I have to use something called subscribe. So using this subscribe, what I'm essentially doing now is I'm now subscribing to the value of this mock API data. And remember in our previous slide I said this observable only we get invoked when I subscribe to it. So that's what I meant. So what I meant in there is, if I now, like, just declare mock API of this, nothing will happen in your code. Like, there will be no data getting created or no side effects happening, which is not the case with promise. So if you create a new promise and this object, automatically that object is created. But whereas in case of your RxJS or observable, what happens is only when you subscribe to it will that mock API data gets invoked and that results get generated. Okay. So now what I can do is, since I have subscribed to it, now I get handle to two things. One, I get a handle to a response, and second, I get a handle to a failure, like a error. Okay. So I get something called a response, and I also get something called as a error. First, let me write it and then we will go into detail. Yeah, I made a typo. Yeah. So now let's try to understand what is these two handle. So what this handle means is, all I'm saying is, like, this mock API data, when I'm subscribing to it, when I subscribe to it, I get two handles or two responses, you can say, or two data string. One could be the response, which is the actual response which is received from the observer, and in case if there is any error, so assume, like, I'm trying to do an API call and that API call fails. In that case, I won't get a response, rather I would be getting an API like error, right? So I can handle both of these separately. So in my response, what I can do is, so just for the sake of this demo, we will just console log it. Okay, so I will just say console log and response. And similarly, if I get some error, in our case we won't get error, but still if we get error, I will just console log it as error happened. Okay, just to make the code a bit readable, I'm just putting it in different lines. Okay, so and you see this subscribe is showing a slash because it is telling that it is deprecated and all, but that is fine. It's only for the demo purpose we are doing it. In the real world, there's only like a very few scenarios where we'll be doing this. I will also tell you the scenarios where you will use this, but for now just hang on with me. So I got you understood, like, what you have done so far. In our test service, we have created an observable. How to create an observable? One way of doing it is by using of operator, and whatever we pass inside of operator is nothing but the response you receive. And later in my lazy2 component, what I have done is I have subscribed to that mock API data in my test service, and I have subscribed to it, and after that I receive two handle. One is the response and one is the error. So in the response, what I've done is I just console log the response, and if I get error, I'm just telling error happened. Okay, and maybe I'll also just print that error as well. Okay, so this is what I'm doing right now, and how I invoke this subscription is by clicking when the user clicks on this button over here which says subscribe to mock API. That will invoke the subscribe mock API function, which will then invoke this subscription. Okay, so I hope now that is clear to you. So if you come to the application, you'll see that there are a few errors. Now let's try to debug it. Okay, So here, if you see, one quick thing is, it is telling that there is some missing parenthesis, and also this is one way which you can debug your application. Just try to understand what is the error being thrown over here and see the line number. So based on that, we just, all we need to do is just go back, and we have to understand what is the error that is coming, and we need to fix it. So in this case, I just added an extra curly braces, so that caused the issue. Removing it as fixed. So now what I'll do is, I'll come to my second lazy loaded module. Okay. And now when I click on, I'll just clear the console over here so that we understand it. So I'll just click on, just hang on a minute. I think, yeah, I think there was some server issue, but yeah, now it is fine. So now we have created this button over here, subscribe to mock API. So if you click on that, you'll see that now we have received the observable. So this is what I meant, like your observable will only get executed when it is subscribed. So only when we clicked on this subscribe did this come, and the number of times you subscribe it, that many instances of that subscription will be created, and you will get the data that many times. Okay. So what I mean that your subscriber works as a stream. So assume that here what we have done is, in like in the off operator, we have just kind of like returned this once, right? We are not doing it as a multiple time. But say assume like you have a scenario where you kind of like set an interval, and you kind of return it after every interval, like short interval of time. So every time like that data is emitted, this result here will get updated automatically. So that's what we meant, like it can also subscribe to a stream of updates. Okay. So now we saw that this is one way of creating a like a observable. Let's see what is the other way of creating observable. So the other way of creating observable is by using a concept called as subject. Okay. So subject is also an observable operator which is available in RxJS. So subject again has two types. So either you can use a behavior subject, or you can use a subject. Okay. So we'll create both of them for you to like understand what is the meaning difference between them. So I'll just create one more variable name here called as mock subject. And how to create a subject is, we just have to instantiate it. So what we have to do is, you have to use the word keyword new, then we give the word subject, and that's it. Okay. And remember one thing, that subject by default like will be created as empty, like you cannot pass it a data, like you have to pass it data at a later point of time. Okay. Whereas for behavior subject, the advantage is that we can instantiate it with some value. So if I put behavior subject, and here say like I just pass it some way, like array like 1 2 3. So the advantage with behavior subject is that I can give it some value, but in terms of behavior subject, right, I like I can instantiate it just like empty. Okay, that is the advantage. So for your interview and your project perspective, if you have a scenario where like you want to have a observable with some initial value, so either you can use off, or you can use behavior subject. But if you have a scenario where you just have to have a dummy or a mock subject with no value, and but later point of time you might insert a stream into it, then go for subject. Okay. So just understand that concept clearly. So now with this subject and behavior subject created, let's try to understand how we can now pass data to this subject. Okay. So come to your lazy component. What we will do is, we'll just create another function. We will just call it subscribe to, or rather we will say emit behavior stream. Okay. So what I'm trying to do over here is, I'm just trying to emit a new data from this behavior from the subject which we have created. So for that, what I need to do is, we just do as mock subject. I will subscribe, and same thing, like I get two handles, so I'll just take the response handle, and I will just console log it. Okay. It's not required that you have to also mention the error every time. So if you don't want to handle the error, that is fine. You can just write response and console log it. That is fine. And we have not included the round brackets and curly braces for arrow function here, because that is an ES6 shortcut. So if it's just like one line, you can also write it in this way as well. Okay. So what I have done right now is, I have created that mock subject, and I've just subscribed over this. And as you may expect, what will happen is, so let me just clear this out for you, because anyways. So if I just again create a button over here, and I give it the name of whatever we have done. Save it. Mock subject API. And if I come back, so now I have created another button over here. So earlier, if we subscribe to the mock, the of the observable, we see that the data is coming. But if I subscribe to mock subject API, nothing is coming on the browser because there is no data that is being emitted by this observable. So that is another point to remember, that this will only console log something when the response is received. Since your test service does not have that value inside it, that's why there is no console log that is happening. So now the question arises, how can I, is there a way that can I add data into this behavior subject stream now, which my subscriber can listen to? Yes, we can do that. And how to do that is, what I will do is, in my previous function, right, which is mock subscribe mock API, after I console log everything and do all that stuff, what I'll do over here is, I will just kind of write a dummy data to this mock subject. Okay, so how to send a new data stream from observable is by using next operator. Okay, so when you use next operator, what it means is, in my using my current observable, send this next stream of data to the subscriber. So that's why we use next operator. So when we use next operator, inside that we can pass it some data. So here in this case, I will just pass it something like 4, 5, 6. Okay, so I hope you understood what we are doing. So initially, since this subject observable is not having any data, so what I'm doing right now is, when I click on this subscribe to mock API and I get the data for off variable, after that I'm just telling my subject observable to emit the next set of data. So now my subject observable is not empty, it will be emitting its first data, and since it is emitting the first data, when I subscribe to it over here, I will get the response. Let's see how it happens. So I'm just refreshing my application once, just to ensure that there is no console log or anything. So first what I will do is, I'll subscribe to mock subject API, and as you can expect, nothing is coming on my screen because there is no data. But if I click on this mock subscribe to mock API, you will now see that the console log has happened. Why it has happened is, when I click on mock API, what it does internally is, first it will subscribe to this mock API, get the data. So that is what you are seeing over here. This is the off operator which we defined earlier. After that, what we have done is, we have asked this mock subject to return this value 456. And since you have already subscribed to this mock subject over here, that is why the console log is happening now. So that is what I meant, as and when you get stream of data, that also gets console logged. Okay, so I hope that makes it clear. As similarly, just the way you did it for mock subject, you can also do it for behavior subject. So in behavior subject, since we already have a data, so I'm just kind of duplicating this code to help you visualize it. Okay, so what I've done now is, I just created a behavior stream function which is subscribing to my behavior subject observable, and once I receive the data, I should be able to see it on my screen. Right. So let me just go back and refresh. So when I click on this mock behavior, you'll see that immediately I get the data. And why I get the data, as I said, because behavior subject will expect some default value, and since you have already assigned it a default value, that's why you're seeing it in your screen right away. Okay, so that is the concept of RxJS operators and behavior subjects and off variables, and how you can subscribe to a variable, how you can kind of uh, what to say, get the response and manipulate it and all that thing. Okay, and before we go any further, I again want you guys to go back to the rxjs.dev, and over here, what I want you to do is, for the lack of time, there is something here in the overview tab called as operator decision tree. Okay, so wherein what you can do is, they give you kind of an if else condition. So if say you decided that you want to do something with your observable, or you have a bunch of observable and you want to do something, or you have not yet created observable, so you can play around with this condition to see which operator does your condition suits. So say for example, I say I have no observable yet. Okay, and say I want to create a new observable, and here I after that it asks, is there any other condition that wants. So say I say that it just like say for the logic, I just say that it just emits value on a timer, and I say it should emit it regularly. Okay, so then it will tell me for this you implement this using the function interval. So if I click on this interval, it will first describe what is the logic I need to use, and also it will give me a example of the functions that I need to use, how can I implement it in my function. And similarly, you'll also see some related functions to that. So in case you want to combine this with something else like a timer or a delay, you can click that and you can see how that works, and then you can combine all this to make it work better. So yeah, with that said, I think we have reached we have completed the basics of RxJS. So let's come back to the slides.